Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have a finished sweater. I have some new handspun yarn, and I have progress on two sweaters that I'm knitting simultaneously. Both are top-down, seamless, set-in-sleeve sweaters, but they have different construction methods. And I'll answer questions from viewers about two other set-in-sleeve construction methods and how they might be the same or different from these two methods. So let's get started. So I wanted to show you this sweater that I completed. I completed it. I did all the knitting. I finished all of that for Finish It February. It was a lot of re-knitting is what I had to do for Finish It February. And I sewed it all together and I had to weave in the ends and do the final blocking. And I got started on other things and it completely slipped my mind. And so I made sure to block it this past week and so that I could wear it for you today. So this is a traditional Danish sweater. It's from this book, Traditional Danish Sweaters by Vivian Hoxbro. And the actual sweater pattern was designed by one of her students. So this book has a big section about the history of these sweaters. These are really the first garments that we would today call a sweater, made from wool, worn as something that could be seen, wasn't underwear. It was part of the actual daily wear and night wear, because they didn't necessarily distinguish between what they wore during the day and the night. So sometimes these are called Danish night sweaters. They've been around for, I think the 1700s is when is when they started to be worn. They were different lengths in different time periods. And so when you look at historical objects, you can kind of date them based on how long they were. So there are a lot of sweaters that she has taken photographs of that are in different like folk museums around Denmark. And there's a big stitch dictionary in there. She tells you how you can go about designing one, and she shows you different elements that were common at different time periods in different parts of Denmark, so you can create your own. So these 8-pointed stars are very common. You'll see 8-pointed stars in a lot of different traditions, in weaving and knitting. Norwegian knitting, that's the two-color knitting, you'll see those stars in there. This has 3 different 8-pointed stars going up the front, and then at the top of the back near the neck there's a 4th smaller one because the back of the neck is higher than the front of the neck. This sweater has these diamond patterns on it. Another thing that you'll see is that there will be horizontal patterns and then there will be vertical patterns. So there's a horizontal zigzag pattern across all the way around. And then you start getting these vertical panels. And so here I've got some diamonds going up here too. The ribbing are these little 2-stitch cables. And so you see that at the bottom hem. And you see that up here around the neck as well. So you'll notice, and people who've been watching this whole saga of the sweater since July will know why the cuffs and the bottom bands of the sweater are different colors. And that's because I originally bought 3 skeins of fingering weight yarn to make this sweater, and I got home and I got, I don't know if it might be really cutting it close. So I contacted the dyer to see if he had a 4th skein, and he did, and he mailed it to me, and I kept it together. And the way that this sweater was constructed is you start with the sleeves, knit those 2 things, and then, because this is a vented side right here, the 2 hems are knitted separately, and then they are joined and overlapped a bit with decreases. So you have those little ribbed cables here, and then they're joined together, and then they come up, and you have create that seam line right here. But there's that overlap there, so you don't get this weird gap when they separate. So I knit the 2 sleeves and one of those bottom bands with the first skein that I used, and then I started on the 2nd skein, and it wasn't until I joined in the round and gotten a little way up the body that I realized these were 2 different colors, and I had to figure out if all 4 were different or if there were 3 that were the same and one that was different and which one was different. Well, it turned out the dark one was the different one. I had a lot of advice from people when I figured this out. They're like, oh my gosh, I would be so upset. I would shove it in a corner and I would just forget about it ever. I had some people say, frog it all and start over. Somebody's told me to frog it all and start over with different yarn. And I didn't want to do any of that. I bought that 4th skein because I wasn't sure if 3 was going to be enough. And so I wanted to finish the body because that was going to be interesting. It would not be interesting to rip everything out and re-knit 2 more sleeves when I just had to knit 2 sleeves. That would not have been interesting. So I knew that I could cut one of those bottom bands off and re-knit it so that they matched. I could do that later, but I wanted to see how the yarn was going to play out when I finished. So if I really only needed 3 skeins, then I could finish the body with the 2 lighter skeins and not have to break into the 3rd lighter skein, which would have been the 4th skein overall. And I did have to break into it. And so that told me that I didn't have enough yarn to re-knit all of the dark pieces in the lighter color. I also didn't like the sleeves dark. I pinned them on there and I'm like, do I like that? I do not. I didn't like having one bottom band be different than the other. Some people loved it. They thought it was really cool. And if this had been them, then they could have done that. But I didn't like that. I knew I wouldn't leave the house wearing this sweater if it looked like that. And so I put it to the side till finish it February. And then I decided what to do. So what I did was I ripped back the sleeves to the cuff. I ripped back one of them to the cuff because I needed that dark yarn in order to knit a second dark band for the front of the sweater. So I did that. I cut this horizontal band off up here and then rejoined everything and reknit that band. And the reason I did that is because at this overlap, you're overlapping 8 stitches and you're ending up with 3. So you lose 5 stitches on each side, which means you're down by 10 stitches. And so as soon as you have worked your first round totally in the round and then you increase 10 stitches, I did not want to have to try to graft something like that where I had to graft 2 yarn overs or whatever. So I reknit all the way up, so then I had just 2 rows that were the same amount of stitches that I could graft to. And I showed that back in February. And then I could rip out the other sleeve and I had enough yarn. I also decided I didn't like the length of the sleeves. They were kind of 3/4 length, and because these are pretty narrow sleeves, the place that they were going to hit was just going to be too tight on my arm. I did have enough of this lighter color to knit each sleeve an extra inch. They're still on the, you know, they come right to the edge, but it's not a real long sweater. It was going to be a little skimpy, and so when I blocked it, I did kind of stretch it to make sure that I could get enough length out of it. And so I'm happy with that. I do have some little pointy bits right here where I had the pins stuck in, so I'm gonna have to steam those so that those little pointy bits will go down, but that's just from having them be pinned. So when I was debating all of this, I also had a recommendation that I do the neck ribbing with the dark yarn, but that would have required me to rip back the body back down to the base of the neck, because this is not a neckline where you pick up stitches and then knit it. It's the neckline was knit at the same time as the body. So I would have had to rip that back, and then I would have had to work the neckband in intarsia. And that was just like, you know, there were a lot of things I could have done, a lot of things people recommended I do, things I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. And that was just kind of the line where I'm like, nope, I don't want to do that. So I'm perfectly happy with this being the same color as the rest of it and having just the cuffs and the bottom bands be different. But if you are interested in this style of sweater and the variations, I would recommend, this is called Traditional Danish Sweaters. And I'll put a link down to the book down there and also to which pattern in here. I believe it's called Annie's pattern. So she explains how you can design all your own sweaters, and then she has examples from her students. So the examples here are only in one size. And you know, some of them would be a challenge to size up. You have to kind of think about where am I going to add extra, like if you needed something longer in this, how am I going to do that without having, you know, you'd have to have more space between each of the stars, and you'd have to know that ahead of time. You'd have to plan. It's not just like, oh, I'll just knit this an extra 2 inches longer. You can't. You have to plan that out ahead of time. I was lucky that the gauge and the sizing worked out for me, that I could just knit it the way it was written. It was a really interesting process, and because I'm so interested in the evolution of the hand knit sweater, this was a sweater that really intrigued me, and I love the fact that it's a solid color and it's done in a knit purl pattern. You know, it clicks all my buttons. So other things about the construction, this is a drop shoulder, so there's no shaping. It goes straight up, and then the sleeves are well, they're done in the round, but it's just straight around. There's no sleeve cap. And so this is a drop shoulder. It does come down here, and it is close fitting. And it actually works pretty well. It surprised me that it would fit so well as a drop shoulder sweater, but it does. And I don't think there's any shoulder shaping. I think it's straight across. And then I used a 3-needle bind off at the top, and I used the finessed version where you can get a flat chain lying on the top. I'll do some close-ups of this too so that you can see it, but there's this little chain coming along here that does, so the 3-needle bind off was done on the right side of the work, but it was done so that it would lie flat. So it was an interesting project. It really wouldn't have taken me that long if I had had enough yarn in the same color. It was just having to re-knit 2 sleeves and then figuring out, you know, how I was going to use the dark yarn, and then having to do the cutting the bottom off and grafting it. I knew that was something that I could do, but I know that's something that a lot of people wouldn't either think of doing or be afraid of doing, or wouldn't feel like they technically had the capability. I knew that wasn't a problem for me, and it was just figuring out what I wanted to do and how I wanted to use that yarn, and then executing it. That's it. So I'm very happy, and it's been a nice early spring here, so wearing a fingering weight sweater has been really nice. The yarn, I should mention, it's 100% yak. So yak is kind of a brownish color, and so over dyeing it this color, it just comes out really beautiful. And it's a local dyer here in Minnesota. It's called Rewya Fibers. I'll leave a link down to the website down in the show notes as well. So in the last Casual Friday, I showed you some yarn that I spun from a local dyer. It's Knitting Lizard fiber, I believe. And I just came across her booth at this Crafters Gonna Craft, Crafters Gotta Craft, something like that. It was an event at a brewery. It was first annual event, all these different vendors. It was really fun. I hadn't planned on buying anything, but I really liked this fiber. And it was 100% Falkland. So I'm kind of a sucker for, it's something different. And I have spun with Falkland wool before from my breed study, But I was just happy to see it in something dyed and colored in it. And I liked the color. It was like these blues and greens. And it was labeled O-O-A-K. And I made this joke about, oh, that's how Minnesotans pronounce oak. And then somebody told me, no, it meant one of a kind. And I'm like, okay, but there were two of them. and the vendor had said something about, oh, that was when I was like working out how I wanted to dye this. And so she had the whole bunch of braids of this other color called nautical blue. And so I, hadn't really understood that, but I knew that there were two of them. And after I spun this one up, I thought, I'm gonna ask her for the other one. So I bought that one. I spun it up. And then I put it next to the original one. I'm like, oh, these aren't quite the same color. The second one I bought has more green in it. There was more blue in the first one I bought. And I think the nautical blue probably has even more blue. So they're not the same. So one of them is a little greener than the other. And when I was spinning it, it's a 3-ply, I thought that it was going to end up fingering weight because it was pretty, compressed. And even after I washed it, it seemed thinner. And in fact, I thought with the second one, I thought, oh, I might have spun that finer than I spun the first one because it was obvious that the first one I spun, it was poofier, the fatter yarn. And I also was looking at the one I spun first and thinking, that doesn't look like fingering. And I'm pretty sure I thought that was fingering too. It's just that this bounced up and got thicker. So it is a DK weight. It was definitely seemed like fingering when I had spun it, and even when it was still wet, or maybe it was like heavy fingering sport, but it did get plumper, which I thought was interesting. My daughter is interested in it, but she'll either have to do 2 different projects. There's a couple hundred yards in each one of these, and or she'll have to do it in a way where she's doing color work where it's just not going to be obvious when they're when it's separated by some other contrast color that they're different, or it would look interesting that it would be a little different. So the lesson I learned was, first of all, what OOAK means is one of a kind, and just because there are 2 of them that are labeled one of a kind doesn't mean that they are actually 2 of a kind. That means just have it clarified. So I learned something from that. I was just confused by the whole thing at the beginning. I just didn't understand what I was looking at and what it all meant. Oh, I should mention, I said this was 100% Falkland. Falkland isn't a breed, it's a location. And what it means is that this is wool that came from the Falkland Islands. And in general, the sheep that are there are a couple of different breeds that were brought there. There's like Merino, Corriedale, and I don't remember what the third one is. But the other breeds were created by crossing Merino with something else. So there's a lot of Merino in a Falkland sheep's heritage, but you just don't know exactly what it is, and they're not breeding them together and trying to get certain characteristics. It's just those sheep, they do what they do, and they pool all that wool together and it gets processed together. So they're not trying to separate things out at all. So you can get some variation in it, but just know that there is a lot of Merino in that wool's genes if you run across some of it. Last time in Casual Friday, I was starting 2 sweaters at the same time. Both of them are top-down seamless construction. Both of them have set-in sleeves, but they have 2 different ways of achieving that. And one of them is called Simultaneous set-in sleeves, and the other one uses the Contiguous method. And so I explained the difference between those 2 things, and I started those sweaters at the same time and then stopped periodically so you could see like how these 2 types of sweaters are established so that you could understand the difference. So I'm going to go to the overhead and kind of show you where I am on those 2 sweaters. in a very similar place and with both of them at the moment, but there are some differences, not just because of the way that they're constructed, but because of the choices that the designers made. In the case of the Simultaneous set-in sleeve sweater, I'm the designer. In the case of the Contiguous sweater, the pattern is called Linu. It's the Anka strict, I think is the name. I'll put it on the screen and I'll link down below so you can see the pattern photos and stuff from the link. So I got a few comments on that video asking about two other methods and wondering how they might be related to either Simultaneous set-in sleeve or Contiguous. The two methods, one is called the Ziggurat method, and it's by, is it Asa Tricosa? It's A with a little circle on the top, and it's her method. And then the other one is the one by Julie Weisenberger. It's the Coco Knits method of creating a top-down seamless set-in sleeve sweater. And she calls her method English Tailoring. And so I'm going to talk about that as well. Through the overhead, I'll explain how those things are related to either Simultaneous or Contiguous, and where they might lie on the spectrum between those two. All right, so the Simultaneous set-in sleeve sweater, this is what's left of the original sweater. This is one where I spun and dyed all of the yarn for this, and I made the shoulders too wide. So I have these markers in here where I wanted to make them narrower. And actually what I ended up doing was making the neck narrower, because I have a collar that kind of comes straight up and just flips over. It looks like a shirt collar type of thing. And so I didn't need ribbing that was coming in toward my neck to fill in that hole. So this was really too big of an opening. And so I narrowed the opening and then made the shoulders instead of 24 stitches wide, I made them 23 stitches wide, and then I took out something like 6 stitches out of here. So I reduced this by an inch. So it's going to bring that whole bit in. I had also dyed, it's actually 5 colors in this gradient. It doesn't look like that many because the shift isn't that great each time. So as I was knitting the new top of the sweater, I was getting ready to do the 4th stripe. And I could tell by how much of that yarn I had left that I would not have enough to do the 2 rows. And so I'm reworking this all the way to the underarm, just below the underarm, because the entire sweater needs to be narrower all the way down to the underarm, and then it needs to get bigger to the original width. So I have to add more stitches. So I needed to do this to below the underarm. I wanted to keep the original sweater together as long as possible in case I needed to reference it, or if I thought my numbers were wrong, something, I wanted to be able to see it as long as possible. But I wasn't going to have enough of that 4th color. And the way that the stripes work in this sweater is that, so I have five colors, let's say that's number 1. I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I would go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I needed to do enough yarn to do 2 of color number 4 and then 2 of color number 5. And I had quite a bit of number 5 still left, probably not enough for two row stripes. At any rate, I needed to cut this off and then reclaim color number 4 from the original sweater. So that's why this is this tiny now, is because I've ripped it all the way back to there to reclaim that yarn. So I have a lot of, ramen. I have a ton of the gray yarn. I don't have to worry about that, but I did need to reuse some of the dyed yarn. So I have the sleeves on needles and I have the body on needles. So once I get past the underarms, I'm not that far away from that at the moment. It's kind of bunched up, so it's hard to tell, but I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stripes. I'm very close to doing this color a second time, and then right before the underarms, I'll do that color again. So, not too much farther until I get to those underarms. And then once I get past and I separate for the sleeves, I'll work those for like a round or two, and then I can graft them all back together. So that shouldn't be too much longer. But in order to separate everything, I had to take out the button bands on the collar, so those will have to be re-knit later as well. But the actual knitting part for getting this all back in one piece isn't too much more to do. So I'm excited to finally get this finished and get those bands back on there again. So this is the sweater where I'm using the Contiguous method. This one has saddle shoulders, and it's got pretty wide saddles. So saddles can be, very narrow, or in this case, very wide. And because they're so wide, the top of the sleeve cap is therefore very wide, which means that the depth of the sleeve cap is going to be shallower than if this was narrower at the top. Because in order to go from this many stitches to the number needed to go around the arm would require a lot more increases and a lot more rows than if you start at something that's really wide to begin with, and then get to the width that you need for the sleeve. So it's not a super deep cap because this is so wide. This front design, it's kind of interesting. It kind of looks like cables that I would consider these mock cables, because you use increases and decreases in order to create the shaping, and the increases that are being used are yarn overs rather than something like a make one. So you get the little laciness there on the front panel like this. On the back, it's a little narrower, and it is just seed stitch. So one of the issues with something like this Contiguous method is in having stitch patterns while you are creating the width. So you could do it, certainly could do it. It just would require a lot of planning. You're having to do the increases while you're establishing a stitch pattern and maintaining the stitch pattern continuity. So that's a little tricky to do, but it certainly could be done. So this Contiguous method is one where you never have to cut the yarn, and you never have to stop and pick up stitches anywhere. You start with the stitches for the neck, and then you are doing increases constantly every single row in order to create the width here on the front and the back. So if you missed the last Casual Friday, I'd recommend that, because you can see how these things are built and understand that better. So I want to answer the question, though, about the Ziggurat method and the Coco Knits English Tailoring method. So we're going to go into that next. This is the sweater I was wearing in the last Casual Friday, and it was actually knit using the Ziggurat method. The Ziggurat method is the simultaneous set-in sleeve method that was developed by Barbara Walker, and it's described in her book, Knitting from the Top. Walker has two methods of doing seamless set-in sleeve sweaters. One of them, you do the body, and then you come back and pick up stitches for the sleeves and knit them. But that is not what the simultaneous set-in sleeve method is. Simultaneous set-in sleeve method has you start with the back of the sweater, and then you do the shaping for the shoulders, and then after you have done the shaping for the shoulders, and you have a certain depth of it, maybe like an inch down here. And in the case of this sweater, she also did some shaping at the neck too, so that it would come up like this. But there's like short row shaping to create the slope there, and then you create this sort of depth that you need that's half of the width of the top of the cap. So in Barbara Walker's method, once you have done all this shaping for the back, you would cut the yarn, and then you would rejoin it, and you would pick up stitches along the front here, and you would do that shaping, and you would knit down to that same depth that matched the back. And so that would give you that edge that you've got there gives you the width of, the width of the top of the cap. But after you finish the right shape, right front shape, you'd cut the yarn again, and then you would join it here, and you do that shaping over there. So once you've got the shoulder shaping done, you knit across, and now you have an edge that you can pick up along the top here, and then you can go around the corner, knit across here, pick up these stitches, and then across there. And so now you can do the sleeves simultaneously with the body. That's why it's simultaneous. So the Ziggurat method does all of this. You pick up the stitches and everything, but you do this without ever having to cut the yarn. And so the difference is that after you've done your back shaping, and so you just have this amount right here for the top of the sleeve cap, you come across that, you just pick up the stitches that you have right there. So you have half of what you need for your sleeve cap. Then you turn the corner, and then you pick up along here. And now you go back and forth, and you do your shaping for the front. And once that is long enough, and you have finished a right side row, you purl across, and then you pick up on the wrong side so that you're picking up as if to purl. And then when you get to this half, you've already got those stitches have been picked up. You just purl across them, you purl across the front, you pick up as if to purl here, you pick up as if to purl here, and then you do your front shaping. And once that front shaping is done on the left, you can come across here, pick up from the right side of the work, those front part of the cap, and then just knit across there. And now you can work it simultaneously. So it's a way of avoiding extra yarn tails, which some people would see as an advantage. But it means that you have to be able to pick up from the purl side, and going around this corner it's a pretty sharp corner. So you need to have a couple extra needles so that you, as stitch holder, so that you're not only using one needle to kind of go around these corners, because those are pretty sharp corners. She will say that she based her method on a method called the Tailored Sweater Workshop by Tuulia, Salmela, I think is the name. I don't have her name in front of me. I'll put it on the screen, and I will also link to Asa Tricosa's website down in the show notes, and then I will link to the Tailored Sweater Workshop. But the Tailored Sweater Workshop is she takes Barbara Walker's method. She does a few little tweaks. So like when you're picking up, when you're working across and then you have to pick up stitches, she has you do a decrease here to just make that transition a little smoother. There might be another thing or two she does. But she creates it all in a spreadsheet so that you can do your measurements, figure out your ease, what your gauge is, and then it will basically tell you the numbers that you have to do and gives you that process. It kind of walks you through Walker's method. So it's just an evolution of things, each person building on what the previous person. But the Ziggurat method is the same as the simultaneous set and sleeve method. You still have to pick up stitches, but you don't have to cut the yarn and rejoin it when you're doing all of that initial shoulder shaping. So this is an example of one of Julie Weisenberger's sweaters from her book, Coco Knits Workshop. And so you see how this shoulder seam is kind of, it's not right at the top of the shoulder, it's kind of back of the shoulder. And then you can see when you look at the sleeve cap, there's a little bit kind of a corner that kind of pulls in there. This is a top-down seamless sweater construction, and it is in many ways very similar to simultaneous set-in sleeves, and in one way is sort of similar to the contiguous method. So here I have a little drawing of like the the front of a sweater right here, where you've got the neckline right here, and you can see the slope of this shoulder. And then this represents the back neck going straight across, and you can see that slope. So this is just in here, this is empty space. And so when you sew these together, then that seam line runs right down the top of the shoulder. It would run right down here. What the coco knits method does is it has you start with just the back neck and then a few extra stitches on either side of that. And then as you are working back and forth, you do increases on every single row. And she has a specific increase. She has you do lifted increases, not make one increases. And usually when you stack lifted increases like that, one on top of the other, it presents something that's undesirable, which is it prevents the fabric from stretching very much. But in this case, where we're creating essentially the seam line of the back of the sweater, it's creating a stable, slightly stretchy, but not very stretchy anchor point for the rest of the sweater, because the whole weight of the sweater hangs from the shoulders and the top of the sleeves. So you're creating the width as you're going back and forth, and you're doing these increases. So this is similar to the contiguous method, except that you're only working with the back of the sweater. And as you are creating this shaping, you're going to end up with something, it's going to be deeper than that. And so when you have finished the shoulder shaping, and you start doing what you would do in the simultaneous method, which is you pick up stitches along here. You don't do any shaping here. You work straight. So you've shifted the shaping that used to be in the front, and you've shifted it all to the back. And so then when these two things are joined together, you kind of get that little bit of a pull right there, just because of the angle that this is worked at versus that. But that's the difference. Otherwise, it's very similar. The other difference is that the way she has you pick up stitches along the top of the sleeve cap is unusual. And again, it's adding more stability and providing less stretch, so that the top of your sleeve, the top of your armhole, on the sleeve and the seam line across the back here are both very stable. So this leads me into another comment that I had on a different video. It's a video in the series I did on sweater styles, where I explained how different, like what a set-in sleeve a sweater is versus a modified drop versus a drop shoulder versus a yoke versus a circular yoke versus a raglan, all of those different kinds of things, and then all the different ways that they can be knit seamlessly, with seams, top down, bottom up, all the different ways. And so she asked in that set-in sleeve sweater video, if when you do a seamless set-in sleeve sweater, do you lose the structure that you would get if you had knit the pieces flat and seamed? And so let's go back to face the camera, and I'll talk about that. I have knit a sweater using the coco knits method. It was one I designed myself, and I was interested in what it was because I'd heard about it. And you really, in order to learn about it, you need to get her book. She has a bunch of patterns in here. She does sell individual patterns, but my understanding is that they reference the book, because the process, it's a very specific process, and it would be cumbersome and onerous to include that entire process in every single pattern, particularly once you're familiar with it and you don't need all of that explanation and description. You just need the instructions for that particular sweater. You're good to go. So that's the way that she does it. That's the way she presents her method. She calls it English tailoring. And if you Google that, I think the only place you can find English tailoring as an expression, at least when I Googled it a few years ago, was her thing. So she does have a commercial design background, and it could be something that she observed was done in English tailoring versus French or Italian tailoring. And so it's something that she noticed, and then she provided that label. I don't know. But I have knit a sweater that I designed by looking at this, understanding what the method was, looking at a bunch of her patterns to see what the formula was, like what the basic approach was, so that I could then design a sweater. And the reason that this approach appealed to me for that particular sweater is because I wanted to do a cardigan that had this cable coming down on either side, and I wanted to start it in a very specific way. I wanted to start with what's called a closed cable. So you start with a background of pearls, and then the cable appears out of it. And I wanted to do that while still having shoulder shaping, and there wouldn't have been a good way, or I would have had to start it too far down. I just thought that having all the shaping in the back was a good way to do it, and having that front be straight across allowed that cable to kind of grow immediately out of the fabric and then just roll over the top, so that you see the cable at the top of the shoulder. I'll put a photograph of my daughter wearing that sweater. I don't have any pictures from of the back shoulder, I don't think, but I'll show you a picture of her wearing the sweater so you can see what the sweater was. So let's talk about this question regarding seamless construction and seams adding structure. Seams can add structure, but they're not the only sources of structure. And if you're relying only on the seams to provide structure, then you could have a problem. So the Coco Knits method of having those really stable edges and picked up areas create structure right there, so that you know that those areas aren't going to stretch there. So if you have no ability to prevent stretch where most of the weight of the sweater is being supported, then yes, that's going to all melt down your arms, and your sweater's going to fall off of you. There are a lot of things that provide structure to a sweater. So you don't necessarily need seams if you have structure built in other places. So the Coco Knits method builds some structure right in the shoulders where otherwise you would have seams. So they compare well to having seams. So the other places that you can get structure is from the yarn, the gauge, the stitch pattern, I don't know what else, but those things can all provide structure as well. And also, like the elements of the sweater, if you have a really wide neckline and it's a cardigan, and that is going to slide off your shoulders. Like, there's nothing holding the shoulders up. Or if you have a little seam like that, or something, that's not going to hold it up, because if the cardigan is open, you don't have the front of the neck helping to hold anything up. You've got the back of the neck only, and then these little seams, and then you've got this wide hole that is not causing anything to be held in. So a closer fitting neck could help. You also want to check your gauge. Like if you're working at a really loose gauge for a single strand of mohair is fine, because it doesn't weigh anything, and all that fuzz is holding itself up. But if you are working with something like a worsted weight yarn and it's superwash, that has a lot of drape to begin with. And then if you also on top of that are working at a loose gauge, there's no structure from the yarn, you just have the weight. So there's nothing holding that up. Whereas a non-superwash wool might hold up a little better. If you're working at the recommended gauge, that's going to help too. The scales of the wool are going to help it. If you're working with stranded color work, that's going to prevent horizontal stretch, because those floats are going to prevent some of that. If you're working really heavy cables, you're going to have a lot more stitches. That's going to add more weight. But if you work it at a firmer gauge than you would normally, like on a smaller needle than you'd normally use for that yarn, if you were working the stockinette, that firmness can also help provide structure because it's going to prevent stretching out. My red Aran sweater that I wear a lot on the channel was knit on smaller needles. It was a worsted weight wool, but it was knit as if it were a DK weight. And so I used needles that were a couple of sizes smaller. And that sweater is 20 years old. It doesn't pill, which is another benefit of working at a firmer gauge. And it doesn't stretch out from all the cables. I had a friend make that same sweater. I kept telling her, work to a firmer gauge, work to a firmer gauge. And she worked with the regular needles that she normally knit at. And when she got it done, it was so heavy, it's stretching out. So all of those things can work together. A woolen spun yarn holds itself up really well. So a lot of times it's lighter by weight than a worsted spun yarn is, but even if it isn't, just the structure of the yarn itself, because the fibers are going all different directions, it's just holding itself up. It's not being dragged down. So there are a lot of things that can provide structure that aren't seams. And so you might need seams if you have certain other aspects of the garment that are going to not provide structure or might lessen structure. So it just depends. But the coco knits method absolutely acts like as if there were seams there just because of the type of increases she uses and the way you pick up stitches at the top of the sleeve caps. Let me know if you guys have any other questions about other construction methods. I can't guarantee I know every single one, but I have, for set-in sleeves, I have typically knit a variety of methods because I prefer set-in sleeves over other types of sleeve constructions. So let me know down in the comments if there's something else that you're wondering about. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.